And it hits me, oh my gosh, this is that triangle.
You know, there's explanation for everything that occurred in the Rendlesham Forest incident that doesn't involve aliens at all.
It was completely silent. It comes right over our heads.
He saw a classic flying saucer really standing in the clearing.
He turned over to my father and held his hand, and he looked in his eyes and he said, "We're not alone."
Welcome to Podcast UFO for our live show. We're live every Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on the Dark Matter Radio Network. Please remember to visit the website podcastufo.com. During the show, feel free to participate live in our chat room. And don't forget to like us on our very active Facebook page.
Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Martin Willis, your host, and we have a great show for you tonight with guest David Marler on triangular UFOs and a lot more. And I've been trying to get Dave on for quite some time, and I'm really excited about this. Well, Alejandro Rojas is in Las Vegas this week, so there's no UFO news from him, and I kind of feel like the stay-at-home mom while hubby is doing whatever, who knows what, in Vegas. So I decided to cheat on him and bring in Ryan Sprague. He's going to be talking in a few minutes about his first FOIA experience. And before that, I want to say, after throwing wads of bills into people's foreheads of the tech people over at HostGator, I finally got my email working. That's since January. So it's finally reactivated and working just fine, and I have a slew of responding to catch up on. I apologize if you wrote me a while ago and I didn't respond. Thank you to the supporters that are helping out with the show. And I'll be traveling to Maryland this weekend to spend a couple of days with longtime researcher Ray Stanford, who's going to be going over all kinds of UFO evidence with me. At some point, we're going to be doing some pre-recording for next week's show. So that's right, next week's show is not live, but I'll be in the chat room during the live show. Speaking of chat room, you can go in there, and if you're listening live now, and just go over to podcastufo.com, and it's our easy 1-2 click sign in. Again, I want to thank supporters. For just as little as $1 a month, you can help support us and listen to the full show, the second part of the show. And here's another quick shout out. We have a lot of $5 a month or more supporters. Todd L., thank you. John S., Mark P., Jeremy Z., Linda C., Robin D., Bill E., and there'll be more next week. So it's time to bring in Ryan Sprague. How are you, Ryan?
I'm doing great, Martin. I'm so happy to be here and be the one that you are cheating on with Alejandro.
Thank God. Yes.
I'm honored.
You came up on the show a couple of times. We also debunked one of your April Fool's jokes, so that was good. Yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
That was a fun experience. I thought it would be a funny joke, and it turned out to be the biggest Facebook post I've ever had. So that tells you something right there.
You used all the right keywords. That's what it is.
Yeah.
So why don't you tell us what's going on with this FOIA? You finally received a paper. You did. I know a lot of people have these experiences, but it's always interesting to hear about the process and what you found out.
Yeah, I had been following the work of John Greenwald for a really long time, Martin, over at the Black Vault, where this guy's got over 1 million declassified documents pertaining to, UFOs, national security, conspiracy theories. It's incredible. And sort of took a catapult from that and looked into one of the most intriguing cases, in my opinion, the 1976 Tehran UFO incident. Mm-hmm. So, John, I had spoken to at the UFO Congress last year, and he said, if you're going to request these things for an FOIA, you have to be as specific as possible. If you do not specifically request something, they're not going to give it to you. They don't have the time, they don't have the wherewithal, and frankly, they don't care. So unless you are super specific about what you are looking for and the specific documents, they're not going to send it to you. So it took me a while to sort of gather all the information on this case and see what I was looking for. And I was able to get from the Defense Intelligence Agency all the documents that they had on the case. This spanned over 10 pages detailing the incident reported by both the NSA, the CIA, and the Defense Intelligence Agency. I was very surprised, to say the least. And yeah, it was took a while, as these things always do. But
how long did it take?
It took about, I would say, 5 months or so for me to just get a response from them, and that wasn't even in reference to the documents themselves. That took another 2 or 3 months. But in their official letter to me, they apologized for such a backlog. And yeah, with these sort of things, Martin, you have to be very patient because they get these requests all the time. And just like any government agency, they always have, one person doing these things, especially when it comes to the UFO topic. So we should be lucky that we're getting anything, I guess.
Now, do they treat, as far as you know, do they treat anyone any differently than anyone else, or is everyone treated equally?
I would say everyone is treated equally. Again, it has to do with how you request these things. You can't go to the DIA, the CIA, anything like that and say, I want information about UFOs, or I want your information on Roswell. These are things that they will immediately shrug off and your request will be put in the garbage. You have to show that you have put time and effort into this to get your request answered. So again, being as specific as you can about dates, people involved, certain agencies that perhaps documented the case. These are things that they're looking for so that they have to do the least amount of work to give this back to you. So yeah, as long as you are detailed and specific, they will treat you just the same as anyone else requesting.
Now, is any part of these 10 pages redacted at all?
There were certain things redacted, such as specific names, pilots involved. But other than that, the key players, key witnesses involved in the case were all still there and have also gone on the record. So right there, I think that's why those certain things were not redacted.
Now, did you learn anything that you didn't know already by looking through these documents?
That's a great question. A lot of people have asked me, was there any new information? This case has been available through the FOIA for a while now, but it was very exciting for me to actually get official documentation on it.
You're on the FBI NSA's watch list.
Exactly. I know. I as soon as I got that letter back, I told my friends, "Yep, there we go. I'm in. I've made it in."
Yeah.
But yeah, I think what struck me the most was certain quotations by the witnesses involved that were in the documents. This was a heavily reported and documented case, and extremely fascinating. And this was an encounter. I mean, these pilots, their instruments failed when they got close to these objects, and they were, quote unquote, attacked by the object.
So for the listener who has not heard about this specific case, can you just go over that in a nutshell, just briefly?
Of course. The Tehran Incident happened, Martin, September 19th of 1976, and this was in the city of Tehran in Iran. And this was witnessed by the Imperial Iranian Air Force. They got reports of lights being seen in the sky, so they thought it would be Venus or, the quintessential swamp gas. So they sent an F-4 fighter up to investigate, and when they got up there, they noticed that this was an actual solid diamond-shaped object that was actually breaking off into several other objects that would come close to the pilot. The pilot then landed, reported what he saw, and then they sent up more fighter jets to investigate. And when the fighter pilots got closer to the object, all of their instruments failed. So at that point, what could they do? They had to land and figure out how to approach this thing. An investigation was done afterwards, both by the Iranian Air Force and the U.S. government. And very, very fascinating. I would definitely urge people to look further into it. There's many TV shows that have included this event, but for all of that information, I suggest going to either the article that I wrote or to John Greenwald's Black Vault website and to see the documents firsthand.
Now, what's the name of your blog?
My blog is somewhereintheskies.com.
Yeah, I like that. Great name. Well, hey, Thanks so much, and I hope Alejandro's jealous.
That would make my day.
Yeah. All right. I'll talk to you soon, Ryan. So hang in there, everyone. We'll be right back after the music break with David Marler on Triangular UFOs. Well, that tune was by Carrie Lloyd Whitehouse. And, I played that on mono. I apologize. It doesn't sound near as good. And David Marler, how are you?
I am doing quite well, thank you.
Did you forget to unmute your mic?
I don't know. There's a little lag in the computer.
Okay. Hey, David, I'm real excited to have you on the show. And I've heard your name for quite a while, nothing but good. I've listened to interviews with you, and I'm just real excited. And everyone is on the chat board as well. So we'll be having some questions come in. If you haven't jumped in the chat room and listening live, go to podcastufo.com, and right on the sidebar, it's just 2 clicks and you're in. And so the first hour, we're going to be talking about all types of triangle UFOs, obscure, etc. In the second hour, we're going to be talking about a new project you're working on. Plus, we're going to be talking about the January 5th, 2000 sighting that involved police officers, a real fascinating sighting I've heard about for a number of years, and I can't wait to talk about that as well. So for the person who doesn't know who David Marler is, can you go ahead and say who you are, your background, and all that, if you would, please?
Sure. Well, I've been actively involved in the UFO field now for about 25 years. Always had an interest, even as a child growing up in the early 70s. And my interest was initially piqued back in 1973 during a wave of UFO sightings in and around the vicinity of a small town called Piedmont, Missouri. And that was what initially piqued my interest because I had family and friends that lived down there at the time. And so that was my initial introduction at the age of 5 years old to the UFO subject. But in 1990, became involved with MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, and later became state director. And over the years in doing investigations, I was slowly amassing a very large private library of UFO books, journals, newspapers, news clippings, audio recordings, etc. And, have one of the larger private collections on the subject. And much of the material that I wrote about in my book was derived from many of these news clippings, many of these obscure private newspapers published, anywhere between the 1940s all the way up into the present day.
Wow. And what started you in the particular interest of triangle UFOs?
Well, my initial introduction, like many here in the United States, was the initial cover stories being published in the MUFON Journal at the time. And this was, like I said, in 1990 and into 1991. And, of course, the Belgian wave of these large triangular UFOs started in November of 1989 and stretched all the way into the spring of 1991. And just purely as an academic, just reading about these reports, I was fascinated by a couple of different things, Martin. One, as I'm sure you can appreciate, was just the sheer scale of what was being reported. Historically, we hear these reports of these 20, 30-foot diameter flying saucers or flying discs. So, what these military and law enforcement officers and citizenry over in Belgium were describing were, 300-foot long, dark, triangular objects, not flitting about in the sky so much, but, cavorting very slowly at low altitude over the treetops and virtually silent, if not completely silent. So it was a departure from that classic imagery, that iconography we have of the silver flying saucer zipping about in the sky. And coupled with that, I was amazed with the way in which the Belgian military was not only investigating the reports, but very willingly sharing their findings, their investigative findings with the general public. So it was a huge departure from what we're used to here in the United States with military officials regarding the UFO subject.
Right. I had the pleasure of talking to and meeting General de Brouwer.
Yes.
What a nice man he is. Interesting, and, he was right in the midst of the whole thing.
Yeah, and I have to give him credit for a man in his position. The UFO subject obviously is difficult for us to manage as citizens, but to be in a position of military authority and to acknowledge, as he did at the time, that we have unidentified objects in our Air Force that are in our airspace that are beyond our control. And that's a huge statement coming from a man that's supposed to be in control of our airspace and in charge. And I've been struck by the humility of the Belgian people, not only General de Brouwer, but also a good friend that I've come to know over the years, Mr. Patrick Farron, who is the director of, now it's called COBEPS, but at the time it was SOBEPS, the investigative group that basically cataloged all of these sightings.
Really? I think I saw something on him. Wasn't there didn't they have 2 books or big, huge books full, or maybe even more than that?
Yes, I'm looking at the copies sitting over on my bookshelf right now, actually, and very comprehensive. They've never been translated into English, which one day, hopefully, we can get those translated for English-speaking audiences. But a fascinating compendium of triangular, but not just triangular UFOs that were being reported at the time, but other shapes and sizes, and some of that factors into the historical research that I've gathered. And in point of fact, I'm happy to say that in June, Mr. Patrick Farron will be in the United States, and he will be here in Albuquerque, and we are planning our first face-to-face meeting. So I'm looking forward to exchanging information with him face-to-face.
Well, excellent. Now, I'd say about a year and a half ago, I did more or less a UFO debate with Roger Nygaard, who is a documentarian or film. What am I trying to say? Filmmaker.
Okay.
He did Trekkies and a bunch of different films. And anyway, he had his answer for all of the triangle UFOs. He said they were all military that we don't know about, and that. You hear a lot of, do I want to say skeptics or debunkers, either one, but a lot of times they'll bring up that the triangle UFOs are nothing but something military that we don't know about. What's your answer to someone like that?
Well, let me just say this, because I've stated this to audiences across the country over the last year and a half. I do not deny that some triangular objects, triangular UFOs, if you will, could be military aircraft. Now, those aren't necessarily the low-flying, extremely large objects that are being seen, flitting over the treetops and power lines across this country and many other countries. But to make it a blanket explanation, to me, speaks to the person's ignorance. And I don't say that. I don't say that lightly. And the reason I say that, for anyone that's read my book, these reports go back at least to the late 1800s, and I have numerous accounts of these triangular objects before the advent of powered flight. And I think, you can make that argument with regard to the modern-day reports, and by that I mean maybe over the last 20, 30 years. But then there's some common-sense questions that come into play. Why are we flying these around all over the world, apparently just for the entertainment of civilians who see them, and yet we have no reports of these being seen over military theater operations? If we have military aircraft, and Colonel John Alexander, that wrote the foreword to my book, he and I agree on this point wholeheartedly. If we had craft that can behave, maneuver like these objects are reported to do, we would be using them. We would not be resorting to F-117A stealth fighters, B-2 stealth bombers, which, in comparison is infantile technology. So if we have this technology, why aren't we using it within military theaters?
We're saving it for something really good, maybe.
For the next big war.
Yeah. No, I that makes total sense to me. And if you're going back into the 1800s, they can't really argue that. And I was absolutely unaware that there were triangular sightings that far back. It seems to me you hear about, of course, first was sort of like a winged disc, and then the disc, the flying saucer, so to speak, sort of came into fashion as it seemed, the cigar shape, and then the triangle. It seems to me, I had a discussion, I think it was with Leo Sprinkle just last week, and, perhaps these different crafts, if we're going in the extraterrestrial route to say that's what these are, of course, no one really knows for sure, but if we're saying that is the truth, then they could be from different planets or, just next year's model or something.
Absolutely. And you bring up a good point. I agree with what you just said. We don't know. And it really bothers me when you have, as you mentioned, the skeptics or even many people within the UFO community that are open to UFOs, but they make this delineation where, well, the triangles, those are ours. And this is the thing. If you're going to make a statement, you damn well better back it up with facts. And to just arbitrarily throw that comment out there, what is your basis for making that conclusion? And the basis that I made, the historical argument, as I like to say, is basically in my book, looking at the history, looking at the consistency of these reports spanning worldwide over decades. It really stretches the believability of this theory that these are some type of top secret military aircraft that we're not aware of. And unfortunately, a lot of this goes back, and this is kind of a sacred cow that I'm going to be poking here, so we're probably going to get a lot of chatter as a result of this from the audience. But, people arbitrarily, if you look up triangular UFOs, I see it so often, it really irritates me. They'll state, the triangular UFOs, those are just the TR-3B aircraft.
Yeah.
Okay, well, first off, let's take
it doesn't really exist, does it?
Well, that's just the point. It might. I can't sit here and say that it doesn't exist, but that story really goes back to one individual who claims to have worked on inside military projects. And again, for the audience, let's just take a dose of common sense for a minute. In writing my book, I interviewed aerospace engineers from British Aerospace, Boeing, and McDonnell Douglas. And there may be some aviation aircraft design engineers out there right now that are listening to this. This one individual, who I won't name because I don't wish to give him any more celebrity or audience than he's already garnered, he claims to have worked on this project, but he goes one step further. He says, not only did I work on the project, here's the physics, and here's how the object worked, and here's some detailed schematics of how the object worked. For anyone that has worked in the defense industry, if you are working on a top secret aircraft, or let's just say a component thereof, and you go public with said information, you are going to be arrested, you are going to have your pension revoked, and you are going to be looking at serious jail time. None of this has happened to this individual.
It's sort of Bob Lazar-like.
Well, and that's another sacred cow that I'm sorry, I'm just pretty blatant. I don't sugarcoat it anymore. Bob Lazar is disinformation as far as I'm concerned, in my opinion. And the reason I say that is, sometimes that rubs people the wrong way that have their belief systems hinged on these people and their testimony. But this is what I pose to you. These are the people making the claims. The burden of proof is on them, not me, to tear them down. they have made these outrageous claims, but where are their facts?
Right. I like you, Dave. I can tell you that right now. I think a lot similar to the way you do. I want to tell you a story that is pretty interesting because there's a lot of information that I've had since I started the show on triangular UFOs and encounters with them. And one of them is a listener. I'm not sure if she's listening now. She's in Australia. She said when she was a little girl working in the garden with her mother, all of a sudden this big triangle UFO flew right over them. And this is something that I haven't heard, or maybe I heard it once or twice, but they felt like it was like they were being pressured, like it pushed her right down on the ground, this pressure as it went over. Have you ever heard a story like that?
Not involving an individual, but I just was lecturing in Florida for the state MUFON group down there, and a great group, by the way. I have to thank them publicly while I'm mentioning that. I had a wonderful time. But I actually encountered someone who had a sighting several years ago in southern Illinois, which is where I used to reside up until 3 years ago. And again, I was state Illinois MUFON state director for several years there. His experience involved some type of pressure or downdraft that was affecting a group of trees. In fact, I'll be interviewing him later this weekend to get more additional details on this. But there are a small percentage of situations where there seems to be some effect on the surroundings, especially underneath the object. But the vast majority, usually these objects are seemingly moving through the air without displacement of air, without any electromagnetic effects, although, again, there are some in the reports that I've been able to gather. But it's very interesting, and there are variations within the reports. I don't like to make it sound like every account fits a pattern. There are certainly variations in the reports, but admittedly, sometimes that may be due not so much to the UFO being observed, but the UFO observer. Their lack of visual acuity, maybe their lack of auditory ability to hear the object. Obviously, the wind blowing in the opposite direction. If there was a slight sound, that may inhibit or attenuate the ability to hear that sound. So there are variations in the reports. I don't want to make it sound like it's one homogeneous body of sighting reports. And sometimes it's interesting. You look for patterns, you look for consistencies. But I think equally interesting as a researcher, it's interesting to find those that don't fit the pattern, those outliers where I have no other case that reports that. Isn't that interesting? Shouldn't we explore that a little bit further? There's actually one from 1957, which hopefully we can touch on maybe later, where there was an unusual case that just didn't seem to fit the overall pattern that was in an air intelligence report in Project Blue Book.
Oh, why don't we just go right into that right now? Because I do have some questions on the chat room, but why don't you just describe that particular story?
Okay. Well, besides the newspaper articles and the newspaper archives I went through, I did a comprehensive review of all the declassified UFO MOD files as well as Air Force Project Blue Book files looking for triangular reports. And there were quite a few in all of these different areas. And I sifted through them. I tried to find the best, the most well-documented, even some involving radar confirmation in addition to multiple eyewitness accounts. But in 1957, November of 1957, I found what appears to be a global wave of triangular UFO sightings. Now, I know this may sound strange to those that are familiar to hearing these accounts in the 80s and the 90s. This was 1957. And November of 1957, the Belgian Danish Defense Intelligence Service was investigating a wave of triangular spaceships. That was their term, not mine at the time, in the newspapers. Triangular spaceships that were being reported and investigated. Numerous accounts. I also found a Reuters news article that corroborated that and discussed in detail a particular sighting. But as those accounts were occurring in Denmark, over in Illinois, there were two sightings, one in Illinois, one in Wisconsin on the same night, involving a 200-foot triangular object. And while all of this is going on, within a week's period of time, there was a intelligence report in Project Blue Book involving two fishermen that were in Sumatra, Indonesia, that observed this large triangular object move over their fishing boat. And it described that there were these lights on each point, and there was smoke billowing out of each point. And that was, I've never ever heard of any type of emission like that. And sheer speculation on my part, but I speculated, was this a rare instance of one of these objects in some type of mechanical distress? But I think it's worthy to note that Air Force intelligence officers deemed it credible enough, and again, probably in the context of these other reports they were receiving worldwide, to actually file an air intelligence report documenting this and then making it part of Air Force Project Blue Book files.
Wow, that is amazing. So we have a couple of questions up on the message board, and one is, a lot of times you hear about these craft flying very low altitudes, right over the treetops, as you said. A lot of times you'll hear the description like a football field size or something like that.
Yes.
But are they ever observed at higher altitudes?
They are. Again, fairly rare in the general scheme of reporting that I've been able to document. The Chilean Air Force in 1980 actually had two incidents where the triangular UFOs were being tracked on radar, and jet interceptors were sent up to identify and possibly intercept these UFOs. And the pilot, Captain Danilo Catalan Farias, was able to establish visual contact with one of the objects, which he described as large, dark, and triangular. But these were high altitude sightings, and apparently the objects were departing as a result of the jets closing in on them, during this attempted identification and or intercept. There are other accounts of relatively high altitude triangular UFOs. Now, just to make a little point here, in examining these reports, I don't accept every report at face value. And regarding high altitude sightings, in 1966, there was a report of a triangular UFO that garnered worldwide media attention. I have many original newspaper clippings with a photo of said triangular UFO. But later it was estimated that what this was actually a high-altitude balloon, which, when viewed from directly below, had the shape of a triangle. But in fact, it was more of an inverted pyramid. And there's a French research balloon that was also an explanation for a triangular UFO sighting in Riga, Latvia. That was in the Soviet UFO files, and they were able to film that. And in that particular instance, it was high-altitude triangular, but it also was semi-transparent and somewhat reflective. And the investigators ultimately determined it must have been a high-altitude French research balloon. And so, when I come across these reports, I try to do a fairly good job of vetting the reports and separating the wheat from the chaff, in putting these cases together in my book.
Now, a lot of times you will hear what you just mentioned. It's sort of like a translucent. And also, let's, for instance, the Phoenix lights, you hear about these sort of orbs that are underneath them, sort of like a really unique color, glowing.
Yes.
Do a lot of these triangles have that?
They do. But I will say this. Of all the common patterns, the common consistencies, characteristics that I've found with the triangles, what you're touching on, the lighting patterns, that seems to be the most variable. And I don't know really how to explain that. Again, Martin, we have more questions than answers with regard to these objects. But I do tend to lean towards the idea, and I'm just going to leave it at that. I'm certainly not sold on the idea, but at some point we have to, separate ourselves from all the facts we're gathering. And at some point, as a researcher, you have to speculate a little bit. I try not to go down that slippery slope too much. But I think that these lights, due to the shifting patterns, due to the variability, that the lights may in fact be some inherent part of the propulsion system. And based on maneuvering, based on acceleration, deceleration, etc., that we're probably seeing variable lights displayed as a direct result of the propulsion system that's involved in propelling these objects. But yes, Phoenix Lights was certainly interesting. Interesting thing about that is many of the accounts back in 1997, they described as the object went overhead, they could see these lights that were recessed. And I think that's an important point to bring out, that these aren't just simply lights floating around. And certainly, I tried to weed through accounts in the Blue Book files and Ministry of Defense files where people simply saw 3 points of light. Because let's be honest, Martin, that could be just that. It could be 3 separate independent light sources just flying in a triangular formation. But like the Phoenix Lights case, where you have multiple witnesses describing these lights apparently affixed to some solid, rigid platform that blocked out the stars as it moved overhead, I think we need to take a step back and look at those accounts a little bit more critically and try to evaluate what are we dealing with here.
Right. Another question up on the board here. If you're considering, just to consider the extraterrestrial hypotheses, which alien race is associated with triangles? Have you ever heard of that? Like the Greys, Nordics, reptilians, or something like that. Has anyone ever associated a being with a triangle?
They have. Now, let me preface this by saying that I haven't personally come across any credible accounts that I would be willing to, discuss. But a dear colleague of mine in the UK, Mr. Omar Fowler, who I always like to pay credit to, years ago wrote 2 small monographs on the triangular UFO mystery, which he's extensively investigated in the UK. And I wanted him to be part of my book because really it was his work that served as kind of a precursor to me deciding to go ahead and, take the information that he documented and really try to expand on it even further. And in my book, Mr. Omar Fowler recounts 1 or 2 instances involving apparently an alien abduction scenario associated with a triangular UFO. Now, I've had a lot of people tell me during lectures, have you investigated the abduction mystery and the aliens in reference to triangles? And I said, well, up to this point, you have to appreciate mine was more of a historical endeavor. And when you're looking at newspaper accounts from the late 40s, the early 50s, and certainly even accounts going back to the late 1800s, that was not discussed at the time. It wasn't written about. So just by virtue of the fact I was focusing on older cases, I just didn't come across that. Now, certainly on the internet, there's many claims, many stories of alien abduction and triangular UFOs. I just really can't speak to that just simply because I haven't really devoted a lot of research into that particular area.
Sure, that makes total sense to me. Now, someone else on the message board wanted to know, have you ever seen, not you personally, but have you ever heard of sightings of different types of crafts along with triangle UFOs? And while we're going there, how about multiple triangle UFOs at the same time?
Oh, two great questions. I'm glad you asked me those, Martin. Well, let me answer the second question first. While I was down in Florida, I met a gentleman and his wife who had in April of last year, April of 2014, had observed 9 triangular objects, one after the other, flying low altitude over their property. And this involved at least 2 neighbors and possibly involves some of these objects being photographed or filmed. And this is another interview that I'll be conducting this weekend to get additional information. But I sat and spoke with the man, and I'll be speaking with his wife as well. And this has been investigated by MUFON, and I'm certainly going to be interviewing all of the witnesses involved. But that is just one example, a fairly recent example of multiple triangular UFOs being sighted. And what I am finding is that a vast majority of these triangular reports typically involve at least 2 triangular UFOs. On the evening of March 29th, 1989, over the La Galepe Dam and near the village of Upan, there were 2 gendarmes who had observed initially a large triangular platform hovering over a field. They then watched it move over the La Galepe Dam, and as they observed it for several minutes, suddenly another triangular UFO that matched its appearance came up over a hill, over a rise of trees, and they observed 2 triangular UFOs. Now, going through the historical record, I found numerous accounts involving multiple triangular UFOs, and some even in the military files, which is extremely interesting. In the UK, they've had a number of such reports, and in 1949, over Maryland, there was a daylight sighting by multiple witnesses that was interviewed and investigated by Air Force investigators at the time, and it involved a daylight sighting of at least 12 to 15 triangular UFOs. And it's interesting that Air Force investigators were very open to the testimony of this individual, who was a former Air Force tech sergeant. And Air Force investigators also interviewed his neighbors down the entire city block who had stepped outside to observe the spectacle. This was actually one of the producers for a documentary I just worked on last year, which is going to be airing here in the States this spring. The producer who read my book was very interested in that report, and it was well documented. And there's another one that they're also going to feature besides that case in the episode, and this involved an F-86 Saberjet pilot over Albany, Georgia in 1953, who observed a very distinct, sharp white light, which caught his attention because it just seemed to have a very sharply defined edge to it compared to stars or planets that have that scintillation and twinkling. And he thought, well, I'll increase my altitude, and if the object gets larger, then obviously it's something within the atmosphere. If it doesn't change perspective, it must be a star or a planet. As he did so, within a matter of minutes, he realized that the light that was above him was now beneath him, which immediately ruled out any type of astronomical explanation. And as he then began to descend and approach the object, the light changed into an equilateral triangle, which then divided into 2 triangles, and then they immediately disappeared. So, yes, we have accounts of multiple triangular UFOs. And so we have that, and they have also been cited, to your first question, with other UFOs. We'll talk a little bit about this in the second hour when we talk about the January 5th incident, but suffice it to say that the SOBEPS investigators in Belgium, as well as elsewhere, have investigated these triangular UFOs being seen with other shaped UFOs, specifically rectangular UFOs. On that evening of March 29th that I mentioned, 1989, the dispatcher, Albert Kreutz, at the Upan police station, stepped out on his balcony and observed a triangular UFO float off in the distance. It was quickly replaced by a rectangular UFO with bright lights at each corner. Now, in my lectures that I do across the country, I show his sketch, and then I do a side-by-side comparison of a sketch that was drawn 5 years previously by a witness in New York, the state of New York. And this was a housewife and her daughter coming back from the grocery store who observed, this was in the APRO files, observed a triangular UFO which disappeared behind the trees, and then shortly thereafter it was replaced with a rectangular UFO with 4 bright lights, one at each corner. And when you do the sketches side by side, they're virtually identical.
Amazing. One of the things that a couple of times I've heard this situation, one is Rendlesham Forest, and
yes.
Another incident, a friend of mine cited this years ago in Massachusetts, where an object actually burst into lights. Is that something you've heard more than those, just a few times?
As far as the triangle bursting into light?
Yeah, or changing. You mentioned just a minute ago that one divided or something. Yes,
we have accounts of triangular UFOs merging In other words, two triangular UFOs merging into one. We also have accounts, as I mentioned, with the 1953 Albany, Georgia case of triangles dividing. Now, to even stretch the imagination even further, we have accounts of UFOs, triangular UFOs, that appear to morph or change shape right in front of the eyewitness. We have a famous case from 1954, British Overseas Airway Cruiser case, and this was known as the Flying Jellyfish case. Huh. And the pilot, Captain Howard, was flying from New York to over Labrador and had observed this triangular UFO with smaller attendant objects that were flying alongside it. It kept pace with their plane, essentially the same altitude. The crew observed this for about 18 minutes. The passengers observed it as well. And at one point, Captain Howard's attention was distracted, and when he looked back, he asked, I believe it was Lee Boyd, the navigator on the plane, where did the smaller objects disappear to? And he replied to Captain Howard, well, it appears that the smaller objects went into the large one. And then they observed this large object shifting, morphing, changing shape. And this was well documented. I have some of the original British and American newspapers from 1954 that chronicled this and have sketches from Captain Howard and some of the crew. Now, that's a situation where we have smaller attendant objects going into the triangular craft. Going back to the Danish wave of 1957 that I referred to earlier, the Reuters news article that I found references the Danish village of Brohyr, in which a woman reportedly saw a large, dark, silent triangular object, low altitude. Now, doesn't that sound very, very similar to modern-day accounts? And she described that as she observed the object hovering silently, smaller horseshoe-shaped objects, each emitting a strong light, came out of the larger triangular object. Now, this is Reuters news service that ran the story in 1958. What is of interest is that the news reporters found at least 20 other villagers that corroborated the woman's testimony.
Wow, amazing. Now, would you consider the triangular sightings on the rise compared to other shaped crafts?
Absolutely. Matter of fact, at the beginning of my book, we can talk about frequency, we can talk about increasing sightings, but I really like to try to put some numbers to it. And as you can appreciate, we have different series of statistics that exist within the UFO field. But in 2004, during an early stage of my investigation and trying to start looking at patterns in the historical record regarding these objects, I decided to check my dear friend and colleague Peter Davenport at the National UFO Reporting Center and check the statistics that they had posted at the time. And in November of 2004, I was looking at the breakdown of objects reported based on shape or based on description. And I was amazed to find that the category designated as light, just light in the sky or a report of a light, they had 5,509 reports on file. Now, I think we'll all agree, any conservative investigator out there will agree, that could be Venus, that could be a satellite. It's a pretty vague description when you just see a light in the nighttime sky. Mm-hmm. But 5,509 reports of lights. The second runner-up in 2004 was triangle, 2,782 reports. And when I do my lectures, I always like to compare that to the discs, flying discs that were reported, 2,439. So flying discs are, basically coming in third, after triangular UFOs. And I thought, well, that was interesting, and that's some numbers that at least we can look at. And admittedly, those are raw reports. All of those have not been vetted and investigated necessarily, but it at least gives us an idea of what are people reporting, regardless of the legitimacy or the veracity of the reports. Well, in 2012, I was doing another lecture, and I decided, you know what, I'm going to revisit those statistics just to see if the same pattern tends to play out. And now, keep in mind, this is a cumulative total. But in February 2012, the category of light, there was 13,997 reports. Second to that was the category of triangle, 6,957. And again, the category of disc was 5,288. So we do seem to see an increase in frequency of these triangular UFOs being reported. And I will concede that that might be due to the fact that some of these triangles being reported could be military aircraft. But I don't like to talk in absolutes. I don't like to say all or none, as some of the skeptics like to do. But I do think that some of these triangular UFOs might be military. But when you look at the history, when you look at the consistency, and you compare modern reports to these early reports, I think we at least need to maintain an open mind regarding the subject that these may not necessarily be manufactured here on Earth.
Now, do you actually see more of a concentration in any certain country like Canada or the United States over, say, a European nation?
Well, I certainly have a lot of accounts from the United States. I have a lot of reports from the UK, but I'm always very quick to add that I think part of the problem, and I do call it a problem, not just triangular UFO research, but UFO research in general, is, as you can appreciate, a simple language barrier. I'm sure that we have some South American reports that we're just not hearing about because they may have only been, published in, Portuguese or Spanish. Mm-hmm. And I was just talking to a friend and researcher out in California, Mr. Ted Bonnet, and he was asking me about reports from China. And really, when you look on the internet, we don't see a lot of reports yet. When you look at the country of China, I mean, my God, how many eyewitnesses do you have? But we have language barriers, obviously, that come into play. And if we could break down those language barriers, I think we'd be surprised and shocked at the volume of reports. And wouldn't it be nice if we could have an international gathering of UFO case files where we could put it into a centralized database? And then we could really start looking at frequencies and statistics. But until then, I'm afraid we're still faced with some language barriers, which is why primarily I have accounts from the United States and the UK.
We had a correspondent for a while there in China, but his email keeps bouncing, and he was actually on the show once a month. Now, a question up on the message board, and I think it's a pretty good one. Are any reports of these as USOs, underwater?
Yes.
Wow, can you talk a little about that?
Well, I'm familiar with the USOs in general, but I don't have any accounts of these triangular UFOs being sighted underwater or emerging from water, which is interesting because certainly we do have other UFOs reportedly in association with water or coming in or out of water. One thing I would like to add to that, though, and again, it's interesting to see what the reports reflect. It's also interesting to see what you don't find in the reports. And I'm really amazed that after just culling through hundreds, literally hundreds of these triangular UFO reports over the last several decades, I have not been able to find one credible, and I emphasize that. I've heard some rather curious accounts, but I really don't deem them as credible. But I don't have one credible account of a triangular UFO landing, touching ground, or taking off,
wow, which
is interesting.
Well, the one in Rendlesham Forest, I know that was a small one, but it was purported to, land on the ground with those tripod marks.
Yes. That is the one example, and certainly, let me be very clear, I would not consider that a non-credible case. I certainly do find that a very credible case, but I'm hesitant to put it into the category. I do mention it in my book, by the way, just in passing, but I don't necessarily put it into the category of these large-scale triangular UFOs. But you bring up a very good point, Martin, that was a very good case, and certainly that was described and discussed and well documented at the time. But as far as these large objects are concerned, we just simply have no credible accounts of these things landing or taking off, leaving scorched marks or depressed vegetation. Again, like we did, several decades ago with the flying saucer reports, where we had a number of those, that have been investigated by Mr. Ted Phillips over the last several decades.
Right. There was a MUFON investigator that was on our show. You may even know her, Chase Klotsky.
I know of her. We've never had the opportunity to meet, unfortunately.
Well, she has quite a story about a triangle craft. She went down to investigate and basically tell this person, I believe it was Tennessee, tell this person that what they were seeing was, something else. She went down there to try to more or less debunk what he was seeing, and, he was saying that they're back or whatever. And all of a sudden, this big, huge thing, she saw it coming and went right over them, all standing there together, and that really changed her mind.
Oh, absolutely. I was last year. I was at the International UFO Congress where I spoke, and I had a chance to sit and chat with Mr. Lee Spiegel from the Huffington Post. And Lee was very happy with my book, and very happy that I talked about the Lumberton, North Carolina wave back in 1975. And he said, well, he goes, I went down there and investigated that. I said, well, yeah, I was familiar. I was reading the reports. He said, yeah, but I also saw the object. And it was a similar situation where he went out with some law enforcement officers into near a field where they had seen an object just days earlier. And as they were standing there, they saw these lights off in the distance that slowly started moving towards them. And as the object literally came overhead, the object shone a beam of light down on the squad car, the surrounding area, and Lee and all of these police officers that were with him at the time. And so it's one of those rare instances, as I always like to mention when I cite that case, that's one of those rare situations like Chase, where you go down as an investigator and you suddenly become a participant.
Right. Well, Colonel Charles Halt, he went out there to, more or less tell these guys they were crazy, and then he, changed his life totally.
Well, I hope, Martin, eventually I can put myself in that category, because despite all my academic interest in the subject, I have yet to see one, but I certainly hope one day I will.
Well, we certainly need people like you out there doing the investigation, someone to make it more credible than, just your presentation and your thoughts. I think it really is pretty solid, and I'm glad you're doing this. We have just a couple of minutes left before the top of the hour. And no messages flowing in right now, so I just want to ask one more thing, and that is a lot of times you hear about these going, very slow over houses or fields or whatever it is. Has there ever been any interrupted cars? Sometimes you hear about cars stalling out and then restarting afterwards. Have you ever heard of anything like that with triangles?
Not so much with vehicle interference, but one of the characteristics which I list, I have primary characteristics and secondary characteristics. One of the secondary characteristics is, in fact, electromagnetic interference, apparent electromagnetic interference. And I haven't really found any vehicle interference cases, although I must add that I do have numerous accounts of these triangular UFOs hovering over vehicles that are trying to basically escape. And as the vehicle increased in speed, the triangular UFO increased in speed and kept with the individuals. I have a number of people I've interviewed here in the States as well as over in the UK that had similar instances, but none that involved vehicle interference. But there are some that are in the files where there do appear to be some type of electromagnetic interference. There was one, in fact, again, reported by APRO, and this one occurred in November of 1982 in California. And the couple was actually camping. They were in their tent, and they heard this humming or buzzing sound, and they felt like there was like this extreme static electricity, like there was a sharp prickling feeling all over their arms and their body. And as they exited the tent, they saw this huge manta ray-shaped triangular, essentially, UFO hovering low altitude over them. And then there was another instance in Japan, the only one I have from Japan, courtesy of Mr. Omar Fowler, involving a wedding coordinator who was actually setting up for a wedding reception and saw this triangular UFO fly overhead. And investigators were able to document that in the surrounding area, a number of people had radio interference at the time.
Interesting. Well, we have just one more question I'm going to throw at you, and that is, have you ever seen a really, really good picture of one of these or a really, really good video?
Well, that's a hard one to answer, and I'll try to answer it as accurately as I can. obviously, for anyone that searches the internet or goes on YouTube, you're going to see some really interesting videos and really interesting photos of these triangular UFOs. Unfortunately,
CGI.
Yeah, exactly, Martin. They look real. They certainly look convincing, but when you've had video analysts tear them apart, it turns out that it's actually CGI and other hoaxes. There was actually one that I used talking. It was a video that was filmed in Florida, and like I said, I was recently speaking there, and I show this video that I pulled off of YouTube that was filmed by a news affiliate in Florida a few years back, and I use it to illustrate the fact that all the video shows is 3 points of white light in a triangular configuration with a strobing red light in the center. But there's no objects in the foreground, no objects in the background. I said this could be a 200-foot triangular UFO hovering over a cornfield. It could also be a 3-inch model suspended over your bed on fishing wire in a completely darkened room. I said we simply don't know. So we need to be very careful with photos and with video. I have not seen any that have been, truly substantiated. But really, photos and video, to me, are one of the weakest forms of evidence, if I can use that word. I'm more interested in multiple witness sightings that are corroborated by radar. I think those are the more compelling because, obviously, radar is a little bit harder to fabricate or hoax.
Yeah, but you'll hear the debunking about that. But that's just the way it is. So that's it for part one of the show. Hang in. We'll be right back with David Marler right after the music break to talk about the incident that happened in the year 2000 and a lot more. Thank you for supporting the show. Okay, we're back with David Marler, and we're talking about triangle UFOs. And this hour, we're going to touch on a great case, I think one of the most solid cases out there involving police officers back in the year 2000. But David, welcome back. And before we move on to that, I want to ask a couple of questions up on the message board. And one of them is you keep mentioning Omar Fowler. Is Omar related to Raymond Fowler, or is he just also another UFO researcher?
That's actually a really good question. To my knowledge, there's no relationship whatsoever. But if for anyone that is not familiar with Mr. Omar Fowler, I'd recommend doing a Google search and looking him up. He's been a veteran researcher for many, many decades, and I'll be honest with you, Martin, I really, truly appreciate and value researchers like Mr. Fowler that for decades have dedicated their lives to investigating this mystery. As frustrating as it can be, and I'm sure you can agree with me on that, it can be damn frustrating, but there are those researchers out there, and you mentioned, of course, Ray Stanford, who I was just speaking with this weekend. Ray's another one. I really truly appreciate the decades of dedication these men have dedicated to investigating the subject.
Yeah, I'm actually going down to visit him this coming weekend. I'm pretty excited about it.
Absolutely. He's a fountain of knowledge.
He is, and he's probably listening right now. And by the way, anyone can call into the show, including you, Ray, if you'd like. That's 603-967-4030. And a question up on the message board. Does this mean that you have not personally interviewed a witness with pictures only or pictures?
No, none of the witnesses that, well, I do take that back. We're going to talk about the January 5th, 2000 case, and there was a photo taken by one of the police officers, but unfortunately it was a Polaroid, which, we don't even have those anymore, but it was a Polaroid Instamatic camera, which, for any photographers out there, that, initially, even if it's a daylight sighting or a daylight photo, the Polaroids were not exactly high-resolution cameras, coupled with the fact that it was sitting in the trunk of his squad car and was below the normal operating temperatures, designed for that camera. So a very poor photo came out as a result. And really, from an evidentiary standpoint, it really yielded nothing. But I do commend the Officer Craig Stevens, for at least having the forethought to do that, because in so many cases we have witnesses that are stunned, or as they like to say in the UK, gobsmacked by what they're looking at, that sometimes they have a camera in their hand and they don't even think about taking a picture because they're just literally in awe of what they're observing.
I can totally relate to that, because I had a sighting, and it was like the furthest thing from my mind at the time. Now, before we move on to that particular case, what about noise? You know, you always hear about them being completely silent, but some of them actually have, like, there's a humming noise on some of them. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Correct, yeah. Matter of fact, just real quick, because I know we'll go into it in more detail, but Officer Craig Stevens from Millstadt, Illinois, from the January 5th, 2000 case, he was I believe, the only witness in that series of sightings that described hearing some type of noise, and he described it as like a low decibel buzzing or humming sound, he likened it to like an electrical transformer. And we do have other accounts describing droning, humming, some type of sound emanating from these objects. Now, again, do all of the objects make this sound, and only certain people are A, close enough, or B, have the auditory acuity to hear it? I don't know. But to your point, Martin, the vast majority are reported as being completely silent.
You mentioned earlier that they seem to defy, like, for instance, you hear about this all the time, they may speed up well over the speed of sound, and they seem to defy all of those basic physics.
Yes. Like I mentioned earlier in the first hour, I spoke with people at Boeing, McDonnell Douglas, British Aerospace, and these things, whatever they are exhibiting characteristics indicative of some radical type of propulsion technology beyond combustion jet engines. I think we can at least safely establish that based on all of the eyewitness accounts. It was interesting, though. I can't mention the gentleman's name. I've never gotten permission to use his name publicly with regard to this, but he was instrumental. He works for British Aerospace. He was instrumental in putting me in touch with another scientist in the aeronautics aviation field that I did interview in the book. And I told him, I really thank you for your cooperation in putting me in touch with this professor. And he's agreed to be interviewed for my book. I said, when the book's published, I would like to thank you by sending you an autographed copy of my book. I found his reply rather interesting. He said, "David, you are too kind." He goes on to say in the email, "After all, we're all striving for the same thing, to understand how these UFOs fly."
Wow.
And this was a leading research scientist in British Aerospace that told me that. And I found that to be a very telling statement.
Isn't that something? Well, you can say his name because no one's listening if you want to.
Don't say that, Martin.
I know. That wouldn't be good for business. Now, why are some of the UFOs called Doritos?
Yes. A wave of sightings over the UK several years ago were being called flying Doritos because, of course, they're characteristic triangular shape like the snack chip. And I have a number of original British news clippings when I was running the UFO news clipping service after Lou Farish had decided he didn't want to do that anymore after doing it for decades. And I was getting a lot of newspaper clippings at the time, and they were calling it the Flying Dorito or the Dudley Dorito because it was being seen near an area known, a little village called Dudley. And and it's interesting you bring that up too, because in doing the historical research, for anybody that's out there that's done research, historical research of any kind, let alone UFO research, there's a lot of work that goes into it. And when you're doing searches, internet searches, or you're searching digital archival databases, triangle might be a search term. One of the terms that they used in the 50s to describe these triangular UFOs in the UK, they called them flying deltas. So delta is another search term you need to use. Flying wedge, flying wing, arrowhead. These are all different descriptives that have been used by witnesses over the years, but they're essentially describing the same thing. So you have to be very creative and try to come up with all the possibilities as far as how would people describe these objects.
Sounds like a microfiche headache to me.
Yes. Well, as I like to joke with my friends and my coworkers, I didn't have to wear reading glasses after reading books all these years, but after writing one, I certainly developed a need for reading glasses.
I'm sure. Okay, let's talk about January 5th, 2000, and that was in Illinois, right?
Yes, at the time I lived in southern Illinois, approximately 20 miles from where all of these sightings occurred. This was a very cold night, early morning, the evening of January 4th, the early morning of January 5th, 2000. And it was a series of incidents, and it's really fascinating as a researcher, whether it's triangular UFOs or otherwise, when you can establish a flight pattern of a UFO over a fairly confined geographic area. And that's exactly what we were able to do. The series of incidents began with an over-the-road truck driver that had just arrived in Highland, Illinois, which is approximately 35 miles east of St. Louis, Missouri, just across the Mississippi into Illinois. And he was coming home, and again, the temperatures were very cold. During the summertime, he actually runs a little family fun time miniature golf course. And he arrived just before 4 o'clock in the morning on January 5th and decided that before he went home, he thought he'd better go by his business establishment to see if the pipes had frozen or burst, because it was a very cold, bitter cold night. He pulls his truck in, he exits his vehicle, and as he's walking towards the door to his establishment, a light off in the distance to the northeast catches his attention. And he looked at it, didn't really give it too much thought, but just his initial thought was, wow, that's really a bright star. Enters the building, checks very quickly the pipes. Everything was sound, and no pipes had broken. There was no water flooding the facility. And immediately turns around, exits the building, locks it up, and is walking back to his pickup truck. Looks back over just to see if the light was still there. The light was still there, but it was apparently moving closer to him and gaining in intensity and size. He stood there for what was probably just a few minutes and watched this light move to the south of his position, just over a row of trees that lines the back of his property, the miniature golf course right there. And as the light moved to the south of his position, he realized that the light that he saw initially was in fact affixed to some type of solid, dark object that had, his term, windows on the side, large picture windows with light emanating from the inside out. He watched it move silently over these trees, and then it moved from the northeast to the southwest. As it departed, he could see windows in the back with what he described as dark vertical bars. So he observes this move off, disappears behind the trees, and I always like to describe him as the hero of this story, because if it wasn't for him having the forethought, and I would also add the courage to do what he did next, this whole sequence would not have played out the way we now know it to have played out. He decided that whatever this is, I'm going to go to the police station and notify them. So he went in, told them what he saw. He described it as a flying house moving over the village of Highland, Illinois, and stated that, look, you don't have to believe me, but whatever this thing is, it's moving to the southwest in the vicinity of the neighboring town of Lebanon, Illinois. So there's laughter and chuckling because, we were able, through the efforts of Daryl Barker, my friend and colleague that also investigated this case, he was able to secure copies of the St. Clair County Dispatch recordings of the police officers. So, which is a vital record when you think about it, Martin, that we have the recordings of the officers in communication with each other while the events are playing out, which we obviously don't always have access to something like that. The Officer Ed Barton in Lebanon, Illinois, now deceased, told me that, he laughed at first and said, well, if I happen to find it, what am I supposed to do with it? He was telling the dispatchers this, but he said, well, that's fine. I'll head out and see if I see anything on the east end of town. He observed what was at first two bright lights, then one bright light that then as it approached closer, was two bright lights that were so intense. He said there were these rays that were emanating off of them, and he likened it to the Japanese rising sun battle flag, very distinct rays of light emanating from these. He then hopped on the highway near his vicinity there, moved into Lebanon, and then moved to the east end of town, trying to intercept, essentially, where this object was moving, to the east of town. He pulled his squad car over on Old Route 50, just east of Lebanon, and turned his engine off. He then saw this, what now was apparently a elongated triangular UFO move virtually over his squad car, completely silent. And I've been on location. I was on location with Ed Barton, and this is an area where you could literally hear a pin drop. It's rural. There's no cars out there, very minimal traffic. And he observed this object. As it moved towards him, it then made a flat pivot turn, which is indicative of these objects, and without making a sound, suddenly accelerated from a dead stop and then streaked to the southwest several miles until he lost sight of it. And at this point, he stated if the Shiloh police officer, another village near Lebanon, also near Scott Air Force Base, he said if the Shiloh officer looks up, he can probably see it by now. Now, prior to this rapid acceleration, Officer Barton states to the dispatcher, will you contact Scott Air Force Base and see if they have anything flying in this area? And the dispatcher contacted Scott Air Force Base. They denied having any military aircraft in the vicinity. And then the object was being seen by the Shiloh police officer, which is immediately to the west, right outside the west gate of Scott Air Force Base. And he observed this triangular object, at first moving slowly, then accelerating rapidly and stopping, and then accelerating away again. And this object then, from what we were able to ascertain, moved and continued in a southwesterly direction. Now, while these two previous officers were observing this and discussing this on the police band, as you can appreciate, any other officers in the area that are on the same frequency are hearing this. Mm-hmm. Well, Officer Craig Stevens in Millstadt, Illinois, is hearing all this chatter and thinking to himself, what are these guys seeing? They must be seeing something military. So he's kind of chuckling. And, of course, again, this is after 4 o'clock in the morning, so not much going on in Millstadt, Illinois at 4 in the morning. And he decides, I'll drive to the east end of town. Whatever this object is, I'll see it heading my direction. So he parked for just a few minutes and noticed he didn't see anything. So then he moved to the north end of town, an area known as Liederkranz Park, which really affords a beautiful panoramic view looking to the north and the northwest. In fact, during this time of year, way off in the distance, you can see some of the downtown St. Louis city lights across the Mississippi River. So he's sitting there, and within a matter of minutes, he suddenly notices this large triangular object move over his squad car and move over this field, this wide open field near Liederkranz Park. He hops out, and after contacting the police dispatch, he tells them that he's got the object in sight also, and the dispatcher kind of laughs and says, "Are you serious?" And he says, "It's huge." And then he gets out of his squad car and tries to take a picture with the Polaroid, which, as I mentioned earlier, didn't turn out very well. And he then asks if the Dupo officer has a Polaroid, because, again, it was going from Millstadt now towards the neighboring village of Dupo. Now, this would be taking it basically in a trajectory where it's heading towards downtown St. Louis if it continues on that flight path. And so the Dupo officer hears this, and he starts looking. He drives to the end of town, the east end of town, and doesn't see an object, but sees a conglomeration of lights that apparently was much, much higher and moving from its current position to the northeast. So what we were able to determine is that this object, whatever it was, after Craig Stevens observed it in Millstadt, the object apparently increased in altitude and then moved back to the northeast from the direction the object originated. The reason I say that is, in the initial stages of my investigation, I was surprised that when Officer Stevens reported that it was moving towards Dupo, again, that would have taken it on a flight path right over downtown St. Louis, which even at around 4:30, 4:45 in the morning, which was this time, you think we would have had many, many witnesses reporting this. Mm-hmm. And when I finally interviewed the officer, Matt Janey, in Dupo, he informed me, well, no, it didn't go that direction. What I saw was moving along the bluffs, along the floodplain, and apparently then moved off to the northeast. So that explained why we had no witnesses in Missouri during that series of sightings.
Now, was it limited to just that area, or did you happen to research into see if there was any other sightings? You know, as you said, this thing fled off really fast, so it could go about anywhere it wanted to, of course.
Yes.
Did you hear about any other sightings, even like a day after or anything like that?
Not a day after. In the subsequent weeks and months, I did hear of other accounts, and unfortunately, some of these people initially contacted me, but then when I tried to schedule times to meet with them, and this often happens in UFO investigations, they either get cold feet or they decide that they don't want to meet with me, you know, to do an actual formal interview. So we do have some other accounts. Now, one that I will mention, I contacted all of the neighboring police departments besides the ones I mentioned, thinking perhaps other police officers had observed this. There's a small village just south of Scott Air Force Base to the southeast called Mascoutah, Illinois. And when I contacted Mascoutah, Illinois, I stated who I was. I was the Illinois State Director for MUFON, and I'm investigating this well-publicized UFO sighting, and I'm just simply trying to ascertain if you had received any calls or if, in fact, any of your officers had observed this object. The dispatcher stated, oh, yes, you need to talk to Officer so-and-so. She called in, and she said she saw the object that night. Well, I never got a chance to interview her, never got permission to use her name, so I can't say it. But in several attempts, both by phone and by mail, I was never able to get this officer to come forward and give me her testimony. But the dispatcher lit up like a Christmas tree when I mentioned this, and she said, oh, yes, you need to talk to Officer so-and-so. So I know at least one other police officer observed this but was not willing to come forward. And then approximately a year and a half later, Officer Mark Lopino of the O'Fallon Police Department came forward, and that's also very close to Scott Air Force Base in Shiloh. And he came forward and was interviewed by my friend and colleague Daryl Barker, and he described what he observed being a large triangular object. So we have multiple police officers, as well as the initial civilian witness, the truck driver, that observed this object. We quite literally were able to take their testimony in conjunction with the police dispatch recordings, which were time-stamped, and it gave us a very detailed, point-by-point, literally connect the dots on a map, flight path of this UFO.
Now, of course, there was no radar evidence that was reported, or they were saying, Scott Air Base was saying they had nothing up in the air at the time.
Correct. Yes, and I actually explored, Martin, the radar aspect, and just to jump forward a little bit, this was in January of 2000. In April of 2000, I was asked by the late Lou Farish, a good friend and researcher, to come and speak at the Ozark UFO conference to discuss this case because it had garnered so much initially local and then certainly national media attention. And it was the first public lecture to really discuss the initial findings that we had on this investigation. As soon as I stepped away from the podium, a gentleman approached me, put his hand on my shoulder, presented his business card as if to validate what he was telling me. And he stated, Dave, I'm with the FAA. He goes, I'm here unofficially because I'm just interested in the subject. But he goes, I helped install the radar systems at Lambert International Airport, and I've been with the FAA for approximately 30 years. He goes, if you need any assistance with radar, I'd be happy to help you. Well, obviously, that piqued my interest. Now, I always like to point out, and I mentioned this in the book, he offered to take me on a tour of the radar facility at Lambert International Airport. Now, again, this is 2000. This was around April of 2000, so this was before 9/11, before security was, what it is today. And so I took him up on his invitation. About a month later, when he was in town, he took me to Lambert International Airport. We went into the FAA control tower, met all of the individuals there. We actually went up to the top of the control tower, met with the radar operators, could see all the planes coming into Lambert. And it was really an interesting experience, Martin, because I've dealt with enough law enforcement, I've dealt with enough scientists and so forth, where as soon as I mention UFOs, I can kind of see them repressing that little smirk because they don't necessarily think there's any legitimacy. I'm here to tell you, when I went up there with my friend Richard Taylor, I can say his name, he's become a very good friend of mine. We still keep in touch to this day. When Richard brought me up there, they respected Richard. They knew Richard for many years. But when he stated that Dave is the lead investigator on this UFO sighting that's been making the news with these police officers, every single one of them, Martin, were dead serious and were asking me about all the details. They wanted to know what was going on. They said, well, what have you found out so far with your investigation? You know, where's the investigation at? Have you found any other witnesses? They were very interested. And I do commend St. Louis media for that, because all of the media attention up to that point locally took these officers very seriously. There was not the typical UFO tongue-in-cheek media coverage that we're used to. And so I found that to be very refreshing, as I'm sure you can appreciate. And so I knew at the time that back in 2000, in order to gain radar data, you had to file a Freedom of Information Act request, usually to the local radar facility, but also to their regional facility to obtain the data. And unfortunately, we missed the 14-day window to do that. But Richard was conveying this to one of the gentlemen there, and the person looked at him and said, well, he goes, we've got that data. He goes, what do you mean? He goes, yeah, we've got that data. And he mentioned one of the other gentlemen that's there at the FAA office. He said, so-and-so received a call from an outside agency, and they were told to, quote-unquote, pull the data and to back it up, to save it. And at that time, they had put it on for those computer geeks that remember the old zip drives, zip disks. And my friend Richard was blown away. Up to this point, we thought that radar data was gone. So as a result, I was able to get the radar data, able to obtain software to run it on my computer, and with Richard's assistance, of course, was able to interpret the data that we were looking at. We were able to plot the latitude, longitude coordinates of the witnesses. We were able to take the timestamps from the St. Clair County dispatch tape to let us know the time of their sighting, the location of the sighting, and then correlate that with the radar data. And we were not able, we ran it a multitude of times, we were not able to find any primary targets, or for that matter, commercial or military aircraft, that correlated with the times and locations of the eyewitness sightings, let alone anything that basically followed this flight path that was reported. Now, one thing that was stated by one of the FAA gentlemen that were there was the fact that, well, what was the estimated altitude of this object? And I stated the majority of witnesses said it was approximately anywhere from 500 to 1,000 feet. They said, well, based on where our radar array is located here in St. Louis, and based on the topography and low altitude of this object, we may not have been able to pick it up on radar. But your best option would be to approach Scott Air Force Base. Well, I had already filed a Freedom of Information Act request with Scott Air Force Base. I have a copy of the reply letter, and they denied that they had any military aircraft that either was dispatched from there or that they were supporting in any way. And they stated that their radar system was down at the time of the sighting.
Oh, right.
Which I thought was a cover story, and it might be. But my friends at the FAA did tell me, Dave, for a layman, that does sound suspicious. And we're not saying it's not. But they do weekly and monthly maintenance on their radar array, and they do typically shut it down and do this work between the hours of midnight and 6 a.m. simply because they usually don't have any air traffic scheduled during that time. So was the radar operating? Was it not? We still really don't know conclusively. But as I posed to my readers in my book, if the radar was down, whoever, whatever, was piloting this object, isn't it interesting that they took that window of opportunity to do a flyby by the base?
Right. When you talk about the FAA, having someone from the FAA having a curiosity, it kind of makes you wonder if the government knows just about as much as we do what these things are. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I get that question posed to me a lot when I'm doing my lectures, and we had an interesting discussion down in Florida recently with the MUFON group down there. And I'm somewhat, I guess you can say, somewhat of a minority in the UFO community. I don't necessarily buy off on the, shall we say, the UFO belief system, if I can use that term. My attitude is that, does the government know more than we do about UFOs? I think absolutely, without a doubt. And the reason I say that is they have spy satellites. They have all of this technology for tracking things. If they don't have more information than us, then that's pretty scary. Certainly we have all these accounts of pilots that have shot gun camera footage over the years. My attitude is, if they've shot footage, that footage has been sent somewhere. If they're tracking these objects on satellite imagery, that data is going somewhere. So do they have more information than we do? I think, yes, without a doubt, they probably do. But I always like to make a distinction because, again, the UFO mythology, the beliefs, the central belief system with a lot of UFO believers is that Roswell happened, we recovered technology, we back-engineered it, and what people are seeing today are the back-engineering result of extraterrestrial technology. Okay, that's kind of a house of cards. It's based on a lot of supposition, and we need to take each one of those in turn. First off, let's just say, and I'm kind of an agnostic with regard to Roswell, it could have happened, but I wasn't there. And there's been so many variations of that story told, I don't know what to believe or accept. But I do tend to lean towards the fact that something highly unconventional crashed here in New Mexico in 1947. But let's just take a step back for a moment. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, Martin, if you can bear with me as I go through this hypothetical. If an extraterrestrial vehicle crashed in 1947, and let's just be conservative, let's say it was 1,000 years ahead of us in technology, are we really going to have any fundamental understanding of this technology then or now, if it's 1,000 years ahead of us in technological advancement? And if we recovered said UFO and said alien bodies, does that wrecked ship, does that dead body tell you where they came from, why they're here? What is their belief system? What is their moral code? We may have information, we may have hardware that doesn't equate to having answers. And I really think that, this kind of touches on the $64,000 question. Why is the government covering all of this up? I think it's because they don't know what they're dealing with. I think that they may have hardware, they may have radar tracking, film footage, etc. The list goes on. But that doesn't mean they have answers. And, when you look at technology, and I always like to use the analogy of my cell phone. I've got an iPhone. If I go back and see Alexander Graham Bell and I show him my phone, first off, he's not even going to recognize that it's a phone.
Right.
Now, does he even understand the fundamental concept of how that phone is powered? And then I have to explain to him how this phone really doesn't operate unless it's within a cellular network. How do you think Alexander Graham Bell is going to try to wrap his mind around that one?
Yeah.
Now, I'm only talking, 150 years maybe difference? And I'm talking human technology to human technology. Again, going with that hypothetical scenario, if we're dealing with an alien culture, read into that whatever you will, that crashed in 1947, that's 1,000 years ahead of us in technology. First off, it's 1,000 years ahead of us. Second of all, it's alien.
Right.
What energy source do they use? What materials might they have that we don't necessarily have here on Earth?
Right to all that. Now, if you think about it, this is one of the first times this has happened to me in a long time. I totally lost my train of thought. I was going right into something here.
Hopefully I didn't put you to sleep with that hypothetical.
No, not at all. And it had to do with technology. Oh, boy. I'm going to have to move on to something else and ask you to elaborate on something you said you were working on.
Yes. I actually haven't talked publicly about this other than the group in Florida that I mentioned. I just kind of teased them with that. I can't go into too many specifics, and I'm not being secretive by any means, but I just simply don't want to upset the balance, so to speak, because I'm working on this, and there's a lot involved. Basically, what I'm working on, Martin, is putting together a nonprofit organization with the sole goal of preserving historical UFO case files and information. Now, one of the situations that really bothers me with regard to the history of UFOs and UFO investigations are the missing APRO files, Aerial Phenomenon Research Organization. Mm-hmm. An estimated 11 four-drawer file cabinets consisting of approximately 15,000 UFO case files from the early days, from 1952 all the way into the mid-late 80s, basically is disappeared. There's a whole story behind that. For anyone interested, they can just type in missing APRO files, and they can read the history on this. But the point is, we apparently have lost all of that information. And I don't want to lose additional information because I'm not interested in the UFO subject because it's a mystery and because it makes for great campfire stories. I really want to know what's going on. I want answers. And we need to preserve the data that we already have. The motto of the X-Files was always, "The truth is out there." I would argue that the truth is in the files we already have. I'm working with a large organization that's sitting on one of the largest bodies of case files going back to the late 50s. And my goal is to get all of those files, case files, digitized and uploaded to the internet so people will have free and open access to review these files. We're talking thousands of UFO case files that have really never seen the light of day. And I'm working on that as well as another collection of case files in a European country. I can't say any more because I haven't even talked to the individual that's in possession of these files yet. But what I'm trying to do is preserve the cases we already have that we're not using currently. And it's all about data points. In analyzing my triangular UFO book and putting all that information together, the only way I was able to extrapolate the data that I did was by doing a systematic comparison and analysis and organization of triangular UFO reports. Let's take that concept, but on a much broader scale with UFO case files in general. And I know MUFON is kind of working on a similar project in this regard with their files. And perhaps one day we'll unify all this into one centralized online database. And
nice.
My goal is to preserve this information. When you think about it, thousands of UFO case files that are not readily available to the general public. If we can get those digitized, because God forbid a fire occurs or a flood, those files are lost forever.
No,
and we need to preserve that.
Sure. We had someone on from MUFON, I think about 2 weeks ago, and he was saying because he's a MUFON investigator that he has full access to the files. But the average Joe out there who was not involved that deeply in MUFON could not get a lot of that information. Of course, I understand like the anonymity in that you have to keep, that secure to have it safe for people to report. But
absolutely.
Say, redacted their names out and something like that.
And that would be part of this project as well, too, because we do want to guarantee the anonymity of witnesses that have come forward over the years, certainly.
Mm-hmm. The thing that I had totally blanked out on just a minute ago was I was going to say that if the government absolutely knew as much as we did about what these things are, in other words, they didn't have much more information other than they found a crashed saucer or two here and there, they would be scared. They would be scared that they didn't know, and of course, that being said, they wouldn't let us know that they didn't know.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Absolutely, it serves no purpose. And again, I know this. That I'm poking a lot of sacred cows here tonight, Martin. So I may get a lot of hate emails. But the question came up about disclosure, that being a very hot topic in the UFO community today, and had a very wonderful exchange actually with the gentleman that posed this to me in Florida recently. And he said, "Well, what's your thoughts on disclosure?" I said, I commend the people that are lobbying for that. But I said, in my own personal opinion, I think it's an exercise in futility. I said, getting people to sign a petition is not going to pry the very firmly tight lid of this cover-up regarding UFOs. You're not going to pressure the government to release information on this if they don't want to because you signed a petition. I think that's just a little bit of naivete on the part of...
That's not how it would happen. If it would ever happen, it would have to be so spectacular, like landing and living among us, and something really spectacular before that would happen.
And I say that with the utmost respect for those individuals that are really working toward that. I wish them the best of luck. Me personally, I'm going to focus on the phenomenon rather than trying to lobby the government to release their files. The government may or may not have good reasons for suppressing this information and keeping it secret. As we touched on earlier, Martin, I think a lot of it is they're just dealing with this inconvenient situation, the 300-pound gorilla in the room that they don't want to officially acknowledge, because we pay our tax money. Really, one primary reason is for what? For security.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And if you suddenly acknowledge the fact that we're faced with a phenomenon that A, is real, B, we don't know where it comes from, C, we don't know really why they're here, and we have no ability to control the situation. Do you really think any, not just the United States, any world leader or military group is going to step forward and acknowledge that?
Exactly. I do commend Chile and a few other countries for really taking this subject seriously, though.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think some of the countries that have come forward and released their files may have released all they had. Again, they may be absent of physical trace evidence. They may be absent of having any answers. And what's interesting is, again, those are all data points. You know, if we can take the Project Blue Book files and disregard some of the ridiculous explanations they made for some of these UFO sightings and look at just the report, because as I say in my research on triangles, I take those reports at face value. I don't necessarily even look at the Air Force explanation because in some cases it doesn't make any sense. The Albany, Georgia incident that I referred to, they stated their final conclusion, it was a visual sighting of the planet Venus. Now, as I like to point out, there's two problems with that. One, the pilot, when he accelerated and increased in altitude, realized that Venus was now below his jet. So I have a hard time resolving that as a semi-educated, logical individual. And then secondly, the Albany, Georgia Regional Airport was tracking an unknown primary target in the location at the time that the pilot observed his UFO. So we have radar confirmation.
It was really funny how absurd some of the answers are for, what happened like that. You think of, the whole thing with the swamp gas and all, just explain it away.
Exactly. Well, and it's funny you mentioned swamp gas because one of the surprises I came across doing my historical research, of course, that term was quoted by Dr. J. Allen Hynek when he went up to Michigan in 1966 to look at those sightings around Dexter, Michigan and the Hillsdale College area. In going through the newspaper archives online, I stumbled across 2 or 3 newspaper articles discussing the sightings that were occurring in that area at the time. And I was surprised to find that in the articles, they referenced that many of the initial UFO sightings in the Ann Arbor, Dexter area were being reported by police officers who described the objects as triangular.
Wow.
I had never heard of that before.
How about that? Now, when you're getting someone up on the message board wondered how you got your unique newspaper collection, and a thought came to mind. Do you find out, like, for instance, where a sighting was on microfilm or something like that, and then you contact the newspaper and try to get an edition from that time? Or how do you find your newspapers?
Well, that's a really good question. I really appreciate that. Well, I always like to say that my collection is a collection of collections. And over the years, and this gets back to the preserving history, that's kind of my little mission with UFOs, preserving the history of this field. I've had the pleasure of meeting some of the investigators and researchers over the years, some well-known, others not so much, that were sitting on scrapbooks of newspaper articles that they had collected over the last several decades. And one group in particular, I still have very dear friends in the St. Louis area, an organization that was a precursor to the Mutual UFO Network, or MUFON, was the UFO Study Group of Greater St. Louis. And two of the early members of this organization was Mr. Walt Andrus and Mr. John Schuessler, who were later international directors for MUFON. And John lived in St. Louis. He worked for McDonnell Douglas, and Walt Andrus worked for Motorola in Quincy, Illinois. So they were regular attendees at these meetings. But they amassed a large number of case files, news clippings, scrapbooks, journals, etc. In 2005, I was contacted by the board members who I had come to know over the years, and I had lectured at some of their meetings. And they knew that I was already doing some preliminary historical research. They actually held a meeting, and not to put too fine a point on it, the gist of the meeting was, we're all getting up in our 70s and 80s, and we're slowly dying off, and what are we going to do with all this material? And I'm very proud, and I still would like to say thank you publicly to them. They entrusted all of their material to me because they knew I was trying to preserve all of this data. And so there was a vast collection of case files, news clippings in there, APRO bulletins from the early 50s with, chock full of old case material. Then there were several other aging researchers that I've come to know in Arkansas, Missouri, Illinois, that were either willing to donate their collections or allow me to purchase their collections. Mr. Bill Pitts, veteran UFO researcher down in Fort Smith, Arkansas, I obtained his collection. And then just, like many people, just going on eBay and going on the internet and looking for collections for sale. And so it's just over the last 25 years has developed into this large private library that I have, which I make accessible to any credible individuals that are willing to, come out to Albuquerque and interested in looking at the data. I've had several researchers. I've had Kathleen Martin here. I had Greg Bishop, who wrote Project Beta about the Paul Benowitz affair. I've had Greg Valdez, who's the son of Gabe Valdez, who was the New Mexico State Trooper out here investigating UFOs, cattle mutilations. Mr. Michael Schratt has been out here several times. Enjoy having Michael over. So, I make the information available, and that's part of the nonprofit concept, is to take the data that I have, eventually get all that digitized, because I want to make it readily accessible, but most importantly, make it free, because I believe that this data, this information belongs to everyone.
Right. Now, I'm looking at your Skype picture, and I see a whole bunch of books in the background there. And so are you like archivally, keeping these pieces, like, for instance, in archival folders and things like that?
Well, I'm actually, over the last year and a half, since the book's been published, I've actually had a number of volunteers, retired individuals, that have been coming over and helping me sort through the news clippings. We just finished sorting through literally hundreds of old news clippings, and we're going to be going through the process of doing some inventory. But yes, trying to preserve this stuff, for the next generation, and really excited about, eventually digitizing these case files, because again, Martin, we've been doing this now for 70 years. We are sitting on a lot of data, but we've got to make it more accessible, make it centralized, and make it searchable. Let people, whether it's a student in Paraguay or a retired physics professor in Switzerland, or a college student in Michigan, be able to just go online, access the information, and look for patterns in the data. I certainly don't have any answers, but, there's other people out there who are thinking outside the box that might be willing to look at the data from a whole different angle. And really, when it comes down to it, we can talk conspiracy theories. We can talk about what Martin believes, what David believes. But at the end of the day, the lifeblood of this phenomenon really comes back down to unconventional objects that people reported in our skies. And it comes back down to those old case files.
Have you heard of a gentleman named Rob Mercer?
Oh, yes. I know Rob very well.
Good. I'm glad you know each other.
Matter of fact, we'll be talking this weekend. That's another phone call, and many phone calls I'll be making this weekend.
Yeah, because if you two should get together, and with those files, I'd hate to see them. He and I were talking. He was on the show a while back.
Yes.
And,
yes.
Yeah, I would love to see those preserved.
The work that he's doing preserving those files is tremendous, and I've congratulated him several times that of all people for those files, to wind up with, it wound up with someone that truly appreciates the historical significance of that.
And, I'm that's sort of my background and field in the antiques and fine art and documents and things like that. And documents is one of my passions I really enjoy. And, you think of, like right now, you could say there are probably thousands and thousands of Abraham Lincoln signatures on documents in attics right now that are just being spoiled away because he was a lawyer for, 25 years and signed, many documents.
Numerous documents.
Absolutely. So along those lines, there's probably a lot of UFO information that is out there and unfound at this point. And that is an amazing story, how that showed up on Craigslist. And
absolutely. And it just goes to show to you, as you're mentioning, Martin, you don't know where this data is sitting and how, in a roundabout, serendipitous way, it can come into the possession of us again to where we can have access to it and be able to review that data. It's and for any individuals out there that are from the early generation when flying saucers first came into our modern mindset in 1947, if there's anyone out there with archival material or collections that they don't know what to do with, feel free to reach out to me. I would appreciate speaking with you about that because we're looking to develop this nonprofit group, and I really think we're going to make some headway in preserving these articles of history. And I always make this point, Martin, in my lectures when across the country when I lecture on the subject. UFOs, whether you consider it fact, fiction, or folklore, it's part of our history.
That's right.
And let's preserve it, if nothing else, for historical value alone.
Right. And, we owe that in so many ways of so many documents and current material that, we really need to preserve and pass on to the generations. And a lot of things become rare and valuable because people don't have that mindset and they get destroyed or discarded.
We've heard of researchers over the years, unfortunately, veteran researchers that supposedly had large collections. And, weeks or months after they passed away, the question was asked, well, what happened to all those books? What happened to those newspaper scrapbooks that Mr. Wilson had? Well, from what I heard, the kids didn't share his interest in the subject. They actually kind of didn't like how much time he devoted to it. So when he passed away, they just threw it all in the trash.
I hear that all the time. We only have a few moments left. Now, I looked online. I didn't see a website right off the bat. Do you have one?
Long story with that. I'll just give you the Reader's Digest version. I was scheduled to get one online well over a year ago, but had been involved in so many different projects. Decided to postpone getting one of my own. And again, we're in the preliminary stages, but once this nonprofit organization gets close to getting kickstarted, then we will have a website, and that will be my website, part of this nonprofit group that I can be reached at. I do have an email address, if I can throw that out there.
Yeah, go right ahead.
If anyone would like to reach out with a sighting or with any archival material you might have, you can contact me at triangularufos, that's plural with an S, at hotmail.com.
Did you have a hard time getting that email address?
That was just, I'm sure nobody had taken that one yet. So it was very, and people remember that one. So I figured I'll go with that.
Right. And do you have any follow-up thing that you're going to author?
Well, this is, I have several different ideas I would like to work on, but to be quite honest, I was speaking with a researcher this past weekend about this nonprofit and about accessing some of these case files. And I've had a lot of people, and I take this as a very high compliment. I've never written a book before until my book came out. But a lot of people have asked me, what's your next book going to be on? Or I'm looking forward to the next book by David Marler. I'll be honest with you. I think my time is best suited, and it would be the best contribution to the field of ufology if I really focus my energies on trying to preserve and gain access to these UFO case files. And rather than writing a book, I would like to be known for being able to preserve all of these case files, digitize them so that they'll be around forever.
Well, that's a great project you're into. And we have to say goodnight. It's been a real pleasure.
Enjoyed it, Martin. Had a great time. Thank you.
Absolutely. Love to have you back someday.
Yes, we'll talk more about the project once it gets underway.
Oh, that sounds great. So I want to thank everyone for helping out with the show today. Ryan Sprague for filling in for Alejandro Rojas. Carrie Lloyd Whitehouse for the music. Peggy Shunning for managing our Facebook page. And remember, you can like us on Facebook for all the latest UFO news. Of course, I want to thank our guest, David Marler. And next week, you will be listening to Ray Stanford. I'm going to go down there this weekend. And you can listen to this show live at the Dark Matter Radio Network every Wednesday, 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. This is Martin Willis saying, keep your eyes to the sky.